Welcome to Get Your Books Out, and thank you for joining us. Bringing you the best books you may have never heard of from the world of land, sea and air, gripping adventure stories and tales of military daring-do, tomfoolery, incompetence and genius. If you like our channel, please share, like and subscribe. The Royal Oak Affair. The Saga of Admiral Collard and Band Master Barnacle by Robert Glenton. Author's Foreword. It was the late 1920s, and one of those magnificent social affairs that the Royal Navy organised so well, a dance aboard a flagship of the Mediterranean Fleet, which, with considerable justice, regarded itself as the elite of what was still the biggest navy in the world. Invitations were cherished. Down below in the Admiral's dining room, his distinguished guests were passing the port decanter. On the quarterdeck, naval officers in mess dress and their partners danced a foxtrot under the immaculate awnings. A splendid evening altogether, until the Admiral used a certain swear word. Incredible as it might seem, that solitary oath laid a trail that put the careers of 3 senior officers in jeopardy, and star-crossed the highest ambition of Admiral Sir Roger Keyes, one of Britain's greatest naval heroes. It involved Parliament and left a red-faced Board of Admiralty to face the mockery of the world's press, and to be the butt of the cartoonists. That was when King George V raised a bushy eyebrow and stepped in. Chapter 1. The Fleet That Did Not Sail. Although it was so early in the morning that the sun had not had time to bleach the high stone walls round Malta's grand harbour, its usual hot, faded yellow of summer, the ancient bastions were crowded with people. So were the windows and balconies of all the houses with any sort of view. It was Thursday, 8th of June, 1837, and on the still waters the fleet lay at anchor. Rodney, Caledonia, Asia, Vanguard, Russell, Ceylon, Rapid, Nautilus, the Cutter Hind, and, sign of the times, the 3 still strangely unfamiliar steam vessels, Hedia, Spitfire, and Firefly. But all those watching faces on shore had eyes only for a single, small boat being rowed solemnly from HMS Ceylon towards HMS Rodney. In its stern sheets, under close guard, was a young marine. Private Thomas McSweeney, aged 23, was being taken from his cell to be hanged. The silence was so intense that when the boat poured alongside Rodney in mid-harbour, the voice of the captain, as he stood by the port gangway and read the death warrant, carried across the placid water and could be heard hundreds of yards away. Those on shore could clearly see McSweeney being led forward to the hammock netting under the foreyard and watch the noose being put around his neck. The rope, reeved through a block at the yardarm, led aft to where it was manned by McSweeney's fellow marines and by 2 seamen from every ship in harbour. The captain finished reading the death warrant. A signal gun cracked out, unnaturally loud in the morning hush, and poor McSweeney was promptly hoisted over 60 feet in the air. His body hung at the yardarm for half an hour before the shocked inhabitants of Malta could retrieve and bury it in the cemetery of St. Lawrence on the outskirts of Vittoriosa, one of the 3 old cities on the edge of Grand Harbour. For most years since, the Maltese have tended that grave and kept a candle burning. McSweeney was an illiterate Irishman who had left home with a record of petty crime. What offence had led him to the yardarm? He had been caught slinging his hammock below when he should have been on deck. His sergeant reported him. McSweeney was in a rage. He waited until the sergeant's back was turned, ran forward and gave him a push. His victim fell only a matter of 6 feet or so into the waist of the ship, but it was enough to cause his death. Corporal John Robinson, giving evidence at the court-martial, said that McSweeney shouted as he pushed, "You bugger, I have got my satisfaction now." It was the same oath, again directed at a marine, that was to be heard at least once more and create another sensation in the history of Grand Harbour. On Sunday, the 11th of March 1928, the crowds gathered again on Grand Harbour's ramparts to watch the fleet. It was a great occasion. The Mediterranean Fleet was due to put to sea at 4 in the afternoon to join the Atlantic Fleet, which had sailed from England. It was the season for the combined spring exercises, the greatest occasion in the Royal Navy's year. After the exercises were over, the Atlantic Fleet would return home, but the crews of the Malta-based ships had a much brighter prospect before them. They would cruise on to ports in the south of France and Spain to show the flag and exchange hospitality with shore-bound dignitaries, a time of endless parties, dances, and general festivity. Although 1928 was a year when all the talk was of naval disarmament, the Mediterranean fleet was still a magnificent sight as it prepared to sail. There were the 8 mighty battleships of the 1st Battle Squadron, led by HMS Queen Elizabeth, of 27,500 tons and 8 15-inch guns, and flagship of the Commander-in-Chief, Admiral Sir Roger Keyes. Warspite, Valiant, Barham, Royal Oak, Royal Sovereign, Remedies and Resolution. They were aging giants, but most had had a complete refit and the others were waiting their turn. Then there were the 8 powerful cruisers of the 1st and 3rd Cruiser Squadrons, headed by the flagships Frobisher and Cardiff. There should have been a 9th cruiser with them, but Castor had been sent on temporary duty to the China station. One more cruiser, the Cairo, was flagship ruling the 1st, 2nd, 3rd and 4th destroyer flotillas, 32 destroyers in all, not to mention the Wolsey and Woolston, who lay in reserve. There were the 2 huge aircraft carriers, Courageous and Eagle, and the 9 submarines of the 1st submarine flotilla, plus 8 minesweepers, the hospital ship Maine, with a white-painted hull in dazzling contrast to the immaculate pale grey of the fighting fleet, the survey ship Endeavour, 2 sloops, Chrysanthemum and Bryony. Bryony was not a sloop at all for service purposes, but had been extensively converted as the Commander-in-Chief's personal yacht. At a mine layer, 2 trawlers and 3 humble drifters with pleasantly unwarlike names, Crescent Moon, Sunset and Landfall, not to mention a depot ship, oilers and water carriers, and there was not a creek from Sliema and Lazaretto, from French Creek to the dockyard, not a buoy in all the broad expanse of Marsamak's harbour and Grand Harbour that was not occupied. Not a berth uncrowded, until one wondered by the what ingenuity of seamanship so many vessels had arrived there in the first place. And over all, at 6 tall mastheads, flew the personal ensigns of half a dozen admirals of assorted seniority. It was a superb scene, unrepeatable anywhere in the world today. Immaculate awnings tautly spread over 100 quarter-decks, impeccable decks scrubbed almost as white as the awnings that shaded them, peerless paintwork, gleaming champions in all the great guns' muzzles, each with the heraldic crest of the ship that bore them, a gleam that was repeated 1,000 times or more by the polished brasswork of every single item that the Navy could find a hand to polish, and it was not short of hands. From time to time, premonitory bugle calls rang out across the harbour, and there was the endless high shrill of boatswain's pipes. Between the ships, in a never-ending flurry, motorboats darted, arrowing the still waters with their wakes, stiff-backed bow and stern sheet ratings performing their faultless drill. On the forecastles of all these ships, officers and men were gathering, preparing to unshackle from the mooring buoys and run home the anchor cables. It was an anxious time for them, just as it was for those about to ascend the bridge. Extricating such a large fleet from the narrow limits of Malta's anchorage called for fine seamanship if there was to be no scraped paintwork. Soon the harbour tugs, already with steam up, would be fussing their way on the scene to lend a hand. No wonder that half Malta was lining the ramparts to watch. For a few weeks the island was going to seem very lonely with no navy to throng its narrow streets and crowd its harbour. There were officers' wives and girlfriends. There were prostitutes who were about to have considerable time on their hand. There were owners of bars whose beaded, fly-screened curtain doorways were not to tinkle for some time to come to the entry of thirsty sailors seeking salvation. But most of all, the audience around the harbours and creeks consisted of the ordinary, sunburnt Maltese, to whom the sailing of the entire Mediterranean fleet on spring exercises was as fine a spectacle as any of their beloved firework displays or religious processions. 4 o'clock in the afternoon came, and with it the impossible. Not a ship stirred. The Almighty decrees the rising and setting of the sun. The Commander-in-Chief Mediterranean decides for himself what those times should be for the purposes of ceremonial. He also dictates when his fleet should sail. It is Admiralty immutable, and it has been announced by Sir Roger Keyes himself that the fleet would be sailing at 4 o'clock. Yet not a quarter-deck awning had been furled, and already the unshackling parties had melted from every forecastle. Even the busy motorboats on their errands from ship to ship and shore to shore had disappeared. The fleet was as silent and as still as the calm waters on which it flowed. For quite a while the spectators lingered, the sea-wise naval wives and the islanders all wondering. The whole of the spring exercise program depended on the Mediterranean and Atlantic fleets joining each other on time. What had happened? But night falls quickly in Malta, and gradually the crowds drifted away. Malta has always been famous for its silverware, monks, fireworks, goats and lace. But when Nelson and the Royal Navy arrived, a new element was added to its reputation. Gossip. Gossip about promotion, adultery, other officers' money, or the lack of it. All the ingredients that go to make for a most satisfactory cocktail party, a tea-table chat or a sleepy after-picnic murmur when sprawled on some hot Maltese beach. That Sunday night when the fleet failed to sail, gossip excelled itself. There was no newspaper to buy in order to seek the reason, and the few officers and ratings who managed to get ashore were no help at all. They were just as bewildered. So word of mouth had to do instead. And what word of mouth? Lack of facts has never yet done the least harm to a rumour. Yet during that Sunday there had been clues. The Cross of St. George with its 2 red balls denoting that she was the flagship of Rear Admiral Bernard St. George Collard, CBDSO, no longer flew at the masthead of the battleship Royal Oak. Moreover, a launch had been seen leaving the side of the ship and heading for the shore. Aboard were 2 silent men wearing civilian suits and trilby hats. They had their luggage with them. They were Captain Kenneth Dewar, CBE, commanding officer of the ship, and his second-in-command, Commander Henry Daniel, DSO. As the night lengthened, 3 theories flourished. There had been a mutiny aboard Royal Oak. Rear Admiral Collard had been ordered ashore in disgrace. There had been a secret court-martial. And all the time the great fleet, which by now should have been many sea miles away, lay below in Grand Harbour, utterly mute. Its anchor lamps burned bright, its quiet quarter-decks were well illuminated, the reflection of hundreds of cabin lights danced in the ripples of the dark water. What exactly had happened aboard Royal Oak? Never had the Royal Navy been a more silent service. Royal Marine Bandmaster Percy Barnacle of that ship could have told them. Indeed, he eventually did tell an eagerly listening and incredulous world, for he was to be a central witness in one of the most remarkable courts-martials the Royal Navy has ever had, the case of the incompatible flag officer. Or what exactly did the Admiral call the leader of the band? Next day, when Malta awoke, drew back its curtains, opened its shutters, and stuck its head out of the window, there was another sensation. Grand Harbour was deserted. The Mediterranean fleet had sailed in the early morning. In 1928, Malta was a very splendid place. Nowadays, it is a charming, even romantic island, very largely dependent on tourism and something of a backwater in the world's affairs. Not so in 1928. For many years before that, the Royal Navy had made its own, and every passing decade brought it growing prosperity. Until the Navy came, Malta, ardently and fiercely Roman Catholic, had made its way by fishing and local industry and lived, comparatively poor but contented, amid the crumbling magnificence of its history. For an island measuring only 17 miles by 9, it has a lot to show. Conquered in turn by Phoenicians, Greeks, Carthaginians, Romans and Arabs, it fell to the French less than 30 years after William the Norman fought the Battle of Hastings and took the throne of England. Early in the 16th century, the French handed the island over to the Knights of St. John as a stronghold of Christianity. The knights, who came from countries all over Europe, were a militant lot in those troublesome times. The sun-bleached bastions in which the crowds gathered in 1928 to watch the fleet that refused to sail were the same formidable defences which the Knights of St. John had built. For the knights knew that trouble would come. Each nation housed its members by building imposing auberges, and to make sure no knight would be so errant as to wander off to Italy for a short holiday, laid down a strict rule that every member of the order should dine in his auberge at least 4 times a week. It was a wise precaution, for trouble soon came in the shape of the Turks, determined to destroy the infidels forever. After an exceedingly bloody campaign, the Turks gave the Knights of St. John best and sailed home. For over 200 years thereafter, Malta was at peace. But, as every general knows, one cannot keep a standing army on the alert indefinitely. The Knights of St. John either merged into the countryside, building themselves handsome palaces, any reasonably large house preferably with a couple of shady trees in its garden, can be a palace in Malta. Or they went home and sent their sons to serve in their place. It was an amicable agreement that suited both the knights and the Maltese. Unfortunately, Napoleon spoilt it. He had a war in his hands, and doubted the ability of the knights to defend what was, after all, a keystone to the defence of the Mediterranean. So he expelled the lot, and replaced them with units of his conscript army. The islanders took grave umbrage. The Maltese language has elements of everything from French to Arabic, and nowadays the way the islanders cheerfully watch and listen to Italian mainland television programs shows clearly that they have endured, assimilated, and finally tolerated a number of conquerors and strange tongues in their history. But they are quite capable of turning nasty. In hardly any time they threw the French army off the island. By a happy coincidence, or so it would seem, the British Navy happened to be on hand. If the Maltese could not have their knights, then they would have the British. So a treaty was signed. The British would protect Malta on condition that all the island's rights and privileges were preserved. In 1928, the agreement was still working well. It is true that even the wealthy and well-born Maltese rarely mixed socially with the British establishment except on such formal occasions as anniversary dinners, balls and the like. But there was a happy prosperity that no one wanted to disturb. There was work in the dockyards, and the Maltese earned good pay for learning new skills. From the boatmen in their brightly painted gondola-type dinghies who attended the fleet in harbour, to the swarthy drivers of the horse-drawn gharries ready to taxi any eager group of sailors wherever their spirits, or their thirsty search for spirits, took them. Malta was living well in 1928. The Mediterranean fleet regarded itself, with some justification, as not only the finest force in the British Navy, but in any other navy. And Malta was its home, somewhere to relax, take off its boots, put on its carpet slippers and ease its tie. There was astonishingly little discord. Take Strait Street in Valletta, for example. Cobbled and steeply sloping, it runs its long and narrow way down to the waterfront. Virtually every house on either side was a brothel, a garish bar, or a place of dubious entertainment. The Navy loved it, christened it the Gut, and reminisced over it from Singapore to Plymouth. The prostitutes could be quite appalling. They were cheap. That goes without saying, considering the ratings pay. Many a pink-cheeked ordinary seaman who had recently joined the fleet lost his virginity, his wristwatch, and the signet ring his girlfriend had given him to some shockingly experienced and wrinkled hag. Now the owner of a blinding hangover, the despair of all the naval surgeons who had exhausted themselves lecturing him and his fellows on the perils of such goings-on, and finally having missed the last Liberty boat back to his ship, he would find himself paraded before authority and sentenced to 7 days' loss of pay. Comforted by his messmates, another member of the Gut had been initiated. There was astonishingly little violence. True, there would be the occasional cheerful melee between sailors and the British military garrison, or between the crews of rival ships, but naval shore patrols, gaiters and belts spotlessly pipe-clayed, were always close by, ready to lend a heavy, horny and impartial hand should things become too unruly. While all this was going on, and only the width of a short alleyway, the Maltese would be crowding the equally steep and narrow thoroughfare of Kingsway which ran parallel, spitting out of the shops and cafes that never seemed to close, or crowding round the gas-lantern-lit stalls at the city gate. And, more likely, through the throng would come a slow procession of priests followed by barefooted worshippers, men, women, children, counting their beads, and escorted by an echelon of dogs of no known breed. There would be candles, heavily embroidered banners, and an even heavier shoulder-borne litter swaying with the weight of the huge effigy of some saint or other. Just as possibly, in the slender gaps in the clear Mediterranean sky, there could be seen between the tall buildings fireworks would burst into dazzling light. One thing was certain. In 1928, the Maltese and the British Navy shared the island in harmony, and rarely trespassed on the other's good nature. Not all the sailors sought out the garish entertainment of the Gut. There were other traditional haunts where pleasure was taken more seriously. The Navy had established its pubs, and the Maltese had happily cooperated. The island even brewed its own beer. A few of these bars were custom-built. Often they were little more than the converted front parlours of waterfront cottages. Yet they became as much of a home from home to sailors and petty officers of the Mediterranean fleet as ever a Rose and Crown or Dog and Partridge back in England. On Valletta waterfront were the Iron Duke, the Dreadnought, the Ramillys, and the City of London. Maltese landlords knew a thing or two about a name that would catch the customers. In practically all these taverns, you would see on the wall a large wooden panel, just like the honours board in any golf club. The inscriptions, floridly painted by some fine Maltese hand, started at the top in a modest sort of way. June 26th, 1924. Yeoman of Signals R.J. Smith, HMS Resolution, consumed 18 blues between the hours of 5 p.m. and 8 p.m. Blue was the name of the local beer and came in bottles of something over a pint. And note the delicate use of the word consumed. Each subsequent entry would cast a shadow over Yeoman Smith's feet, and, worse still, the honour of his ship, until one's eyes fell on the latest. November 8, 1927. Chief Petty Officer Brown, HMS Warship, consumed 27 blues between the hours of 6 p.m. and 10 p.m. It was astonishing how often the local records seemed to be held by a fairly senior petty officer. It must have had something to do with the spreading waistlines and experience, certainly not because they earn more pay. Any ordinary seaman showing a trace of form would be sponsored by his messmates, if only for the honour of the ship in which he served. It was the cherished dream of the lower deck of many a flagship to have her name emblazoned proudly on every bar board in Malta. There was a small problem concerning those who attempted to scale the giddy heights of fame, but slipped under the table. The Navy was very tolerant of such goings-on, so long as a man could return on board and make a passing semblance of a salute to the quarterdeck, and even if he seemed to be rather closely attended by one or two shipmates, rarely was an eyebrow raised. The theory was that there was no agony that the Lords of the Admiralty could devise that would in any way match that of the culprit when he was invited to show a leg early the next morning. But for those who could not pass even this simple test, there was an answer: the lodging house on Valletta waterfront. It was very popular and called the Golden Fleet, and so it was to its owner's pocket. There were other, healthier aspects of Jack's life ashore. In the afternoons, boisterous and partisan cricket and football matches were played on arid and dusty sports grounds between rival ships and rival services. And against the Maltese, who were no great shakes at cricket, but who turned out to be demons at the splendid British game of kicking. For the less active and more imaginative, there was a quiet, painful, and sometimes bitterly regretted retreat to one of Valletta's tattoo artists. That was how one part of the Royal Navy lived in Malta. Life was certainly different for officers. For them it was a unique and prized appointment. First, the Mediterranean fleet boasted of its supremacy over every other arm of the Navy, a boast that was not entirely without justification. Secondly, it was a station where even an officer with little to live on but his pay could afford to take his wife. Rented accommodation was cheap and convenient, and with care, expenses could be kept to a minimum. While his richer shipmates could live in high style with fine accommodation, private gardens for the young children, and servants easily available, some even imported English nannies. The climate was pleasant and travelling was easy. In the days before airliners, Malta was a calling point for all the big passenger ships heading east by way of the Suez Canal. There were arrivals and departures almost every day, and in an emergency there were always the overland express across Italy. Many a young naval wife who could never have afforded to follow her husband to China or the West Indies was happy to put up with 3 or 4 days of mild discomfort travelling third class in some liner. Not that the Admiralty altogether approved of such wives. There were still those who swore by the old saying that junior officers should never marry. Commanders ought to and captains must, but in their hearts they knew they were beaten. The Great War, which had ended only 10 years before, had seen to that. Naval wives were not the only feminine company on the island. There were plenty of unattached, attractive and well-born girls who arrived with companions, ostensibly on long holidays or to visit relatives in the fleet, but who were not entirely unaware of the prospects of marriage, with so many eligible young men available. The Navy eyed these visitors with cheerful cynicism and called them the fishing fleet. And there were some fine fish. Not only were many of the most promising young officers in the Royal Navy appointed to the Mediterranean fleet, but also many of the richest. Not a few also had titles. On that Sunday in March 1928, when the fleet failed to sail, there were serving in it 1 Marquis, 1 Viscount, 3 Lords, 3 Baronets, 8 Knights, and 7 Honourables. In the flagship Queen Elizabeth alone, there were 2 Lords, a Baronet, an Honourable, and 3 Knights. True, in this miniature debris, most of the Knights were long-married senior officers, and some of the Honourables were young midshipmen, but the prospects were always promising. So were the opportunities to meet them. Virtually every evening one warship or another would hold a dance or a cocktail party. Many a debutante newly out from home was firmly convinced that the sole purpose of a battleship was to dance on. There were race meetings, picnics, and the opera house. This was Malta's pride, and very elegant it was too. Famous Italian singers appeared on its stage from time to time, and a gala night or a masked ball, with all the naval officers attending in their mess dress, gold braid, and white-lined boat cloaks, was a magnificent spectacle. Even more impressive were the balls at the governor's palace. The ballroom itself was lined with suits of armour and ancient weapons, all gleamingly polished and shining under the lights hanging from the superbly painted ceiling. And just to show that the Navy didn't have a monopoly of the island, the Army would be there too in scarlet mess jackets or dress kilts. Between dances there would be the call of the shady courtyard and, with any luck, a full moon. More prosaic perhaps, but quite as important in the social life of Malta was the Union Club. It had originally been the auberge of the crusading Knights of Florence and was in Kingsway, almost within hailing distance of the Gut. It was made a club in 1826, and Sir Walter Scott and Benjamin Disraeli became honorary members. No woman was allowed near the place until 1907, when they were allowed in by a back door, so they would be quite cut off and would not in any way interfere with the comfort and privacy of its members. Her Royal Highness, the Duchess of Connaught, expressed her outrage at such masculine arrogance, and in 1910 women were admitted through a door in the front of the building, but still, in 1928, only to the ladies' room. At least they are better off than the Maltese, who were not allowed any sort of membership at all. For all its comfort and its painted Venuses on its ceiling, several views were held about the ladies' room. Down below in the lower bar, and a very long bar it was, naval officers referred to it as the Snake Pit, and swore that many an honest sailor's career had been poisoned by the gossip that went on upstairs. Most men would only climb those stairs at the behest of their wives, fiancées, or girlfriends. Even some young women were not exactly enamoured of the place. Too much of the horse-faced aristocracy, they said. Be that as it may, the Union Club made a comfortable, even vital meeting place for naval officers and their women. Most officers who wished to go ashore were entitled to stay there until the fleet stirred itself in the very early morning. There was a prairie oyster bar at Custom House steps, where raw eggs and Worcester sauce were mixed with great industry until well after midnight for those officers who felt they could do with a tonic before returning to their ships and a reasonably early night. Married officers usually slept ashore. There was an area known as Snob Hill by the younger naval wives, because the wealthier Britons lived there. Junior wives lived for the most part in rented accommodation roundabout, in homes with high ceilings, cool stone floors, sparsely furnished but in the narrow shaded gardens, blue larkspur and heavy-scented phlox thrived. The flat-roofed houses overlooked the blue waters of such places at Scaramanga Creek, from where the rattle of an anchor cable could be clearly heard, the throb of a submarine recharging its batteries, and every evening at sunset, the wistful sound of sunset bugles. Dancing and gaiety, sunshine and beaches, a friendly island and a superb reputation. The Mediterranean fleet should have been exceedingly happy. Yet it was not entirely.